third series of the Hamilton Hall Lectures. We're so happy to see so many hearty souls today who braved the weather, and I do want you to know that in spite of the ban, parking will be allowed in this area until about 12:30. Today's speaker hardly needs an introduction to most of you. This is the 27th time that we have had the privilege of listening to Jeffrey Kemp in this historic hall. Dr. Kemp is the Director of Regional Strategic Programs at the Nixon Center in Washington, D.C. His current areas of interest focus on the geopolitics of energy in the Caspian Basin and Persian Gulf, and U.S. relations in the Middle East, especially with Iran. He received his Ph.D. in political science at MIT and his MA and BA degrees from Oxford University. He served in the White House during the first Reagan administration and was Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the National Security Council staff. Prior to his current position, he was a Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he was Director of the Middle East Arms Control Project. In the 1970s, he worked in the Defense Department in the Policy Planning and Program Analysis and Evaluation offices, and made major contributions to studies on U.S. security policy and options for Southwest Asia. In 1976, while working for the Foreign Relations Committee of the United States Senate, he prepared a widely publicized report on U.S. military sales to Iran. From 1970 to 1980, Professor Kemp was on the faculty of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University. He is the author or co-author of several books on the Middle East, two of which are Point of No Return, The Deadly Struggle for Middle East Peace, 1997, and America and Iran, Roadmaps and Realism, 1998. We are indeed happy to welcome back Jeffrey Kemp, whose topic is The Middle East, 1999, A Year for Decision.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be back for many reasons, one of which, at least as of last night, was the delight of getting out of Washington. After I may not be able to get back to Washington as I look out of the room now, and all I can say about Washington is it's wonderful to be in Salem. My only personal relationship with Ms. Lewinsky, I participated in a Saturday morning tennis game, indoor tennis game during the winter, and one of my players is Ken Bacon, who is the Secretary of Defense's public affairs officer, and for a year, you know, Monica worked for Ken. So there was a period when we had to try to make sure whether he was going to be available, because he was always traveling with the secretary. The process of finding out where Ken was and whether he'd be available was done through Miss Lewinsky, who was very charming and very helpful. So that's my story. Sorry. I'm also very sorry that I missed you last year. I was called away literally at the last minute to go to Iran on a rather special visit. I was one of the first former American officials who'd been invited back to meet with the revolutionary government. It was a fascinating experience, and I'll have a word to say about that later. But I was delighted to hear that my former colleague, Jeremy Pressman, who worked with me at the Carnegie Endowment, came up here and gave, I think, a very good account of himself. As you may know, and as has just been stated, we co-authored a book last year, and I will repeat the title because I think it's very applicable to what we're going to talk about today. We wrote a book about the Middle East peace process, and we called it Point of No Return, The Deadly Struggle for Middle East Peace. We chose the phrase point of no return because this is an aviation term that was coined in the 1930s when pilots had to calculate at what point in a flight from destination A they would have to turn back if they wished to return to destination A. And when you got to a certain point, dependent upon your fuel consumption and your engine capacity, you passed a point of no return, which means you could not go back to destination A. It did not absolutely assure that you would reach destination B. In other words, you were up there, but you couldn't go back. And that's pretty much where I think the Middle East is today. There have some very fundamental changes have taken place. There will be no going back to the old structure that we saw in the past. But there is absolutely no guarantee that we are going to reach an amicable settlement that will be satisfactory to all the players. Second part of that book, as I said, was titled Deadly Struggle for Peace. And we do, as we speak, face a deadly struggle. Now look, I mean, every year that I'm here, I have to go through this litany of things that have happened in the past year because nothing's ever quiet in the Middle East. Consider the following headlines. We are still bombing Iraq today. 7 years, 8 years after our great victory in Operation Desert Storm. Saddam is still alive. He's still tormenting and terrorizing his population. And there is no easy exit strategy for our policy in Iraq. Israel, 2 days ago, suffered its worst casualties in Lebanon since 1997. It is still fighting a war in Lebanon 17 years after the invasion in 1982. This is coming at a very divisive time in Israel with a very important election scheduled for May of this year. A gentleman called Osama bin Laden, who you have all heard about, is at large, planning and plotting terrorist acts against Americans, American facilities, and maybe even the continental United States. He has been seeking access to weapons of mass destruction. He has a lot of money, and while he may have been damaged in the recent crackdown that we have imposed on him, he's still out there. Last week we saw throughout Europe riots and killings that stemmed from the fact that the Turkish government had at last arrested the leader, Mr. Öcalan, who has been in charge of the Liberation Army, the PKK, that the Turks argue had brought terrorism to Turkey. It's created an uproar in Europe, and the issue of Kurdish independence is now once more very much on the agenda. 2 weeks ago, King Hussein died, and you recall this was a very emotional and very important moment. Any of you who saw the funeral or the extracts from the funeral, you could only be moved by this very straightforward, rather stark ceremony. The combination of the kafir, the Bedouin headdress, and the Scottish bagpipes representing, a lot of the traditions of Jordan. It was the child of the British after World War II, and of course it stems from a very long-standing desert family. The fact that all the world leaders went to Amman, Jordan for the funeral The fact that President Clinton took with him former Presidents Bush, Carter, and Ford, I think symbolizes how important this man was. And therefore, one of the critical issues we have to discuss this morning is what is going to happen to Jordan now that this very important, brave man has died. Another issue that is now uppermost in the minds of everybody in the Middle East, it's not about terrorism, it's not about bombing, it's not about leadership, it's a much more universal issue, but creates great question marks. Low oil prices. The price of oil in comparative terms, that is to say the amount you can buy with your current dollar, has probably never been lower in this country. And the same goes for Europe and Japan. Now, low oil prices are great for us. Just look outside and see all these huge sports utility vehicles people are driving because they don't even think about the price of gas. Contrast that to the 1970s. But for the oil-producing countries of the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, the Arab Emirates, it is a disaster because plunging oil prices have literally cut their revenues by up to a third in 1 year. Now imagine what would happen in this country if Clinton suddenly announced that there was a third less money in the federal pot. I mean, it would create an absolute firestorm because programs would have to be cut or we'd have to go deep into debt. And the question is, while oil prices have a favorable implication for our economy, if they destabilize the economies of these countries in the region, then that could create political trouble. And with political trouble, you could have unrest, and with unrest, you could have conflict, and when you have conflict, you could have disruption of oil supplies. So the irony is that low oil prices could lead to a breakdown in the social and political structure in the Persian Gulf, which in turn could lead to interruptions in oil flow, which would mean a rise in oil prices. Now, these are all issues that are very, very important for the United States and for all of us, and therefore each of them, I think, needs a little more elaboration. Now, let me go back to the first point I made. Saddam Hussein and Iraq. This is the number one issue because this is where the United States is committing so much of its treasure at this point in time. We have a massive force out there, both at sea and on land. And the fear is, of course, that Saddam Hussein has not given up his ambition to be the dominant leader in the Middle East. He still wants to get hold of weapons of mass destruction because he believes that with weapons of mass destruction, he can exercise hegemony over his neighbors. Why am I so convinced of this? Well, first, I'm in good company. The two ambassadors chosen by the Secretary General of the United Nations to monitor Iraq's arms programs, first the Swedish ambassador Rolf Ekéus and now the Australian ambassador Richard Butler, have both concluded after exhaustive scrutiny of the Iraqi programs that Saddam is still seeking these devices. Had Saddam Hussein agreed in 1991, after the war, to let these arms inspectors come in and do their job, go everywhere, get access to all the documents they want, Iraq, within probably 6 months or a year, would have been given a certification of goodwill that would have essentially permitted the sanctions on Iraq to be lifted. But no, Saddam Hussein chose to cheat, lie, and deceive the UN, not the United States, the UN, during this period. and therefore could not be given a good housekeeping seal of approval. He was prepared, now listen to this, he was prepared to forego approximately $120 billion in oil revenues that he could have had if he'd gotten the certificate of approval in order to keep the option open to build and produce these weapons. So, I mean, when people say, well, how do you know this is what he wants to do? One question you ask is, but look at the price he's paying to keep this option open. Because Saddam would argue, if the Iraqi people suffer, it's short term, and anyway, they're there to serve me. The oil will still be in the ground 10 years from now. With weapons of mass destruction and a major military capability, we will be able to call the shots, and we will quickly be able to get as much money as we want by selling oil at terms that we will determine. Now, as you know, there have been setbacks for Saddam Hussein. He has tempted us, tormented us. We have bombed him again, and bombing him today. And I would say right now in Washington there are two prevailing views on what the status of Iraq is. There are those, particularly in the White House and the Department of Defense, who believe that Saddam is weaker today than he has been any time since the war. They don't believe that his imminent demise is any time soon. But they do believe that the bombings around Christmas time and the systematic attrition that he faces in these daily encounters has caused a lot of losses for his military and his communication system, and his behavior in the last 2 or 3 months has been very erratic. He has threatened his Arab neighbors. He has called for there to be an uprising in Egypt against Hosni Mubarak. He's called for an uprising in Saudi Arabia. He has not tried to make friends with his Arab neighbors. Quite to the contrary, he has lashed out at them, and therefore he's even more isolated in the Arab world than he was in the past. While there is huge sympathy for the Iraqi people in the Arab world, there is now no sympathy for Saddam. So this point of view would say, sooner or later, this man will crack. Someone in his family or some disillusioned general will assassinate him, and then we can have a new start. Now that may well be what happens, we don't know. But there is another point of view that you hear in Washington, primarily from the critics of the Clinton administration in Congress and aspiring Republican candidates, who argue that it's the American position that is getting weaker day by day. Why? Simple. Because only one other country, Britain, has agreed to join in the use of force against Saddam. The French have said no. The Russians have said no. The Saudis have said no. We can use their bases to refuel, but we cannot use them for bombing. So most of the bombing is done by naval jets based on aircraft carriers. There is a split, in other words, in the United Nations Security Council. And the United States and the United Kingdom are in a minority. And the feeling is that if this continues, ultimately the sanctions will be lifted irrespective of what the United States wants. And at that point, Saddam will be perceived to be a victor. And the group that argue this point of view say, therefore, we must take much more bold measures to get rid of Saddam Hussein. We can't continue these sporadic bombing attacks. We have to actually mount a campaign to overthrow him. We have to support and fund opposition groups. We have to establish bases in the region. We have to do this seriously with serious money. Now, myself, I think both points of view have a lot of wisdom and truth in them. My own feeling is that the first point of view probably has more credibility than the second, because I think Saddam has indeed been hurt by the recent activities. But I could be wrong, and certainly I would not rule out the fact that a man who feels he's beginning to lose it, as Saddam undoubtedly does, is precisely the sort of man who could do something terrible. And therefore what we have to worry about is that as Saddam gets weaker under this first scenario, he may then lash out at his neighbors with whatever chemical and biological weapons he has left. And that, of course, brings me to the second really unpleasant issue we have to discuss: terrorism. Now, the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden, who at last count was hiding out in Afghanistan, it is known has had contacts with Saddam Hussein. It is known that bin Laden has enough money and enough contacts to at least seek access to weapons of mass destruction, and here I'm talking about chemical weapons, biological weapons, and maybe even nuclear weapons. Where will these come from? Most likely source, the former Soviet Union. Some of you may have seen a rather frightening frontline program earlier this week called Russian Roulette, which was a really, I think, powerful indictment of what has happened to the Soviet nuclear infrastructure and how it is literally falling apart through lack of money. And when you have no money and you don't pay dedicated soldiers, they're very open to suggestion that they might sell, cheat or lie, anything to get by day. And therefore you have all this lethal material lying around the former Soviet Union, no real structure protecting it, and people on the outside like Mr. bin Laden who have cash. And therefore the linkage between the conditions in the former Soviet Union and the sorts of activities that people like bin Laden can engage in is one of the top concerns today in Washington and indeed elsewhere. Now, I mentioned the Kurdish uprisings that we've seen over Europe this week. The story here is very simple. I mean, the Kurdish people, who are a distinct ethnic group that speak a language more like Persian than Arabic. They are Muslims, but they live in parts of countries. They live in parts of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and a few in Russia. They were promised statehood after World War I. They have never been granted statehood. Each of the countries where they are a minority have treated them differently, but there are more Kurds in Turkey, and it's in Turkey that the issue has reached the most violent levels. And what the problem here is that a lot of Kurds have fled from Turkey and elsewhere in the Middle East to Europe, where they now number over 300,000, and they've become a very vocal and on occasions violent critic of the Turkish government, and that is why you see these uprisings in Europe rather than the United States, because we do not have a large Kurdish population here. This is important because the Kurds, at least some of the Kurds, including the radical Kurds, have received support from Greece, and Greece and Turkey have a whole list of reasons for disliking each other way beyond the Kurds, Cyprus being just one of them. And therefore, whenever two friendly countries, NATO countries, Greece and Turkey, get into a major quarrel, we have to get worried, because Greece and Turkey are right there in the Balkans. And I'm not here today to talk about Kosovo and Bosnia, but just look at the map will show that the proximity of Turkey and Greece to the Balkans is such that a crisis between these two countries could affect Europe itself. King Hussein. Why was he so important? Why is Jordan so important? He was important because he was the first Arab leader to really recognize that the Jewish state of Israel was here to stay, and that dreams of eliminating the Jewish state, pushing the Jews into the sea, a statement that is still made in some quarters but was made most dramatically by President Nasser in 1967, Hussein always knew that wasn't going to happen. He wanted to work with the state of Israel. He was constrained from making peace with Israel for many years because he has a very large Palestinian population in Jordan. But once Mr. Arafat and the Israelis signed their famous agreement in 1993 on the White House lawn, then it became very easy for King Hussein to make a formal peace with Israel. And Israel has regarded Jordan as one of its most stolid supporters in the Middle East. And it's not just a question of the king and his attitudes, it's a question of geography. Jordan occupies a large piece of real estate to the east of Israel, between Israel and Iraq. And of course, the Israelis regard Jordan, therefore, as a buffer state. As long as they have a peace with Jordan, no Iraqi army can come west unless it goes also through Syria. And therefore, there are very important reasons why Jordan, it's been essential to keep Jordan in the Western camp and to keep it at peace with Israel. Now, the question is, what's going to happen now? As you know, in the final days of King Hussein's life, there was an extremely nasty family squabble about who would be the successor. For many, many years, the designated successor had been his brother, Crown Prince Hassan, a very well-educated, sophisticated, Oxford-educated gentleman who knew the job, knew the issues, well-respected, well-liked in the United States and in Europe, more controversial in the Arab world. He was seen to be a little distant and a little too intellectual. He had a Pakistani wife that didn't sit well with some people, and he was not very popular with the Jordanian army, which of course is the key to power, as it is in so many countries. When King Hussein decided to replace the Crown Prince, his brother, with his eldest son, Prince Abdullah, there were a lot of eyebrows raised. But it turns out that the succession has been remarkably smooth, that Crown Prince Hassan, as he was, has endorsed the new king, Abdullah, as he became when his father died. And what do we know about King Abdullah? First, he's in his 30s. He is very popular. He's a soldier. He's a serving officer, and he is the head of the Jordanian Special Forces. And as you know, in all countries, special forces are the elite, and to get there, you have to be pretty good. He is well liked by the army, huge plus. He is very westernized. His mother was English, mother is English, but to offset that, which might be considered a disadvantage in Jordanian politics, his wife is a prominent Palestinian, which puts him in good grace with the Palestinian community, which is very important. He seems very charming, he seems very level-headed, but he's untested. His father had, an incalculable experience in dealing with the world. King Hussein came to the presidency, to the monarchy, and became king when Eisenhower was president, and therefore has met and worked, and he knew Truman before, when he used to escort his grandfather around. So he has worked with Eisenhower, with Kennedy, with Johnson, with Nixon, with Carter, with Ford, with Reagan, with Bush, with Clinton. I mean, this is rather unique. I mean, a foreign leader who has had personal contact with all these American presidents. His son has had none of this. So the real question is, how good is the son going to be at stepping into his father's shoes? And, you know, the signs are now that it may be a good transition, but we don't know, and it's a huge question mark, and it's something that's going to be watched very, very carefully in the months ahead. And of course, it's going to be particularly relevant to the issue that we come back to every year here, and probably will for many more to come. That is the Arab-Israeli peace process. Where is it today? Well, since Jeremy Pressman talked to you last year, of course, there has been one positive development. There were meetings, you recall, in Maryland in October and December that President Clinton participated in, and the final agreement, I think, was reached in December, the so-called Wye River Accords, where the Palestinians and the Israelis, and you remember this is where the King of Jordan came from the Mayo Clinic while doing his cancer treatment to really bang heads together and say, do this deal. Well, they did make a deal. They did make a deal, and for a moment we thought the peace process was back on track. But then, of course, the bickering began, and the bickering began particularly in Israel, where the Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, is extremely unpopular with his colleagues. Now, I distinguish here between his unpopularity amongst his colleagues with his unpopularity in the country. He has a large, significant following from the person in the street, but his colleagues loathe him. They do not trust him. And he was unable to sell the Wye River Accords to his right-wing critics in his own party. And to cut a long story short, what Netanyahu quite smartly decided to do was to call an election rather than have an election forced on him. So the election is in May, and it is already proving to be one of the most divisive and unpleasant in Israeli history. And funnily enough, it is not really about the peace process, as the previous elections were. It is about Israeli domestic politics. What sort of society is Israel destined to be? One dominated by the clergy, particularly the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, who want to impose much more draconian religious laws on shop openings on the Sabbath and driving on the Sabbath, or the secular groups who want a more secular democracy and a separation between church and state. These are issues that are being debated intensely in Israel, as they incidentally are being debated in Iran, ironically enough, where the similar sort of issues has come to the fore. No matter who wins the Israeli election in May, there will have to be a coalition government if a final peace with the Palestinians is ever to be reached. The reason is that if the Labour Party win, it will be by a slender margin, and they will never be able to get the requisite number of supporters in the parliament to endorse a fully fledged treaty with the Palestinians unless they have the support of the Likud party, the right-wing party. And the Likud party won't give that support unless it is part of the government, and vice versa. So, you know, frankly, less depends upon the person that becomes the new Prime Minister, and more about the coalition politics that brings about some consensus. Because it's only if you have 60% of the Israeli Jewish population voting in favor of a Palestinian state that you will get a Palestinian state. But I think that's what the polls would say today would be the outcome. And therefore, I think we can say that barring some catastrophe, some new act of terrorism by the Arabs, it's likely that we will see a Palestinian state sometime in the next year or so. Now, Mr. Arafat, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, faces a very tough decision because he has always said that if he did not get a final agreement with the Israelis by May the 4th, 1999, he would be free to declare a unilateral Palestinian state. He's been told by the United States, he's been told by Israel, he's been told by many of his advisors that's not a wise idea. Don't preempt. Negotiate your statehood with the Israelis. Don't try to grab it, because if you try to grab it, they will grab other territory and you won't get very much. So this remains a very controversial issue, but my judgment here is that we will see some compromise, and ultimately there will be a Palestinian state, though whether it will be before the millennium or not, I would not want to predict. Final point, one that needs, I think, a fair amount of elaboration. The other great issue the United States has been involved in the Middle East, aside from trying to nurture an Arab-Israeli peace process, has been, of course, the stability of the Persian Gulf. We've already discussed Iraq as one component of that policy, but the other major issue concerns our relations with Iran and how that is playing out in view of the fact that there have been changes in Iran and that changes in American policy against a backdrop of lowering oil prices. Now, I think for most Americans, the vision of Iran, still to this day, is that of self-flagellating mobs screaming death to America, because that was the image most of us grew up with in the 1979-80 period after the revolution, when the Shah was overthrown and Ayatollah Khomeini established his Islamic theocracy on the people of Iran. To change that image requires a change in leadership. Now, in 1997, the Iranians elected a new leader, and not a supreme leader, but a new president called Mohammad Khatami. And he has proven to be a very soft-spoken but rather canny leader who truly does want to improve Iran's relations with its neighbors and ultimately with the United States. He's called for the evolution of a civil society in Iran, where ordinary people get far more rights than they have today. He has even hinted at breaking down these very clear hierarchy whereby the church or the mullahs really do determine all the policies of the government. He wants to get to a situation where it's more of a coalition, and that the secular developments in Iran can improve. And once Mr. Khatami began to speak in this sort of language, the Clinton administration, quite correctly in my judgment, decided to reciprocate. And so for a year and a half now, we've seen a lot of lowering of the rhetoric. The State Department no longer refers to Iran as a rogue state. They talk about a lot of Iranian behavior they still don't like, but they are lowering the rhetoric, and likewise, Mr. Khatami has lowered rhetoric. The problem is Mr. Khatami has a lot of opposition from his own right wing. Now, these are the people, the conservatives, who are terrified, and I use that word very deliberately, of a rapprochement with the United States. Why? In part because the revolution was against America as much as it was against the Shah. Our influence in Iran in the 1970s was pervasive. We were everywhere. We were training their army, their air force, their navy, their special forces, their police, you name it. We had hundreds of thousands of Americans going in and out of Iran. Our culture was everywhere. So a revolution against America made sense in 1979. Today, of course, it's disastrous for them, because as long as they adopt such a hostile attitude to the United States, we're not going to sell them anything, and we're going to put great pressure on our friends in Europe and Japan not to sell them many things either, particularly for their oil industry. And they're hurting. And the smart Iranians know that the way out of their economic dilemma, aside from rising oil prices, is to start to deal with the United States. But the mullahs, the extreme mullahs, know the moment you start dealing with the United States, it's the end of the game. Because we are the great Satan. We are the great seducer. And the mullahs know that there are 30 million young Iranians out there who were not born at the time of the revolution, or were so young they don't remember it, who yearn for more freedom, who yearn to get access to what everyone else gets access to. These are people who have cousins and aunts in Los Angeles, so they know what's going on in the world and they know what they're missing. And therefore the conservatives believe if you open the door a little to this behemoth, the United States, I mean, we'll just rush in like a tornado and we'll overwhelm them. And you know, the example they use all the time is what happened to Gorbachev in Russia. And I know I've told you this before on these talks, but I'll repeat it because it's a very good analogy. Gorbachev was a communist. Gorbachev did not want to dismantle communism, let alone the Soviet Union. He wanted to reform the Soviet Union so that the economy could produce more goods and services for the people. And he knew the way to do that was to lower the rhetoric with the United States, to work out a deal with Ronald Reagan, and then George Bush, end the arms race, and encourage investment in the West. And all those things were fine. The problem was he became overwhelmed by it. Once Gorbachev had opened the door of freedom, the East Germans, the Poles, the Czechs all said, thanks very much, we're off. You know, and sooner you know it, the Berlin Wall comes down. And once all the East European countries had said bye-bye, then all the national entities in the Soviet Union that were, in their view, independent or should be independent, said bye-bye. And sooner rather than later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist and was replaced by Russia and all the little countries around it, and some not so little ones also. Now, see, this is what the Iranian conservatives fear. Open the door to the United States and you'll get swept away. Will they be able to resist this? Probably not, for these reasons. And think about these statistics. When the Shah was overthrown in 1979, the population of Iran was about 32 million. Today, 1999, 20 years later, it is about 67 million, more than doubled. The population has more than doubled. The per capita income has more than halved. Double the people, half as well off. And as I said before, you have this huge number of young people coming to an age now where they need jobs and they want access to the world. Iranians are going to have to find, for the next 10 years, 1 million new jobs a year just to keep up with the population growth. They cannot do this if they are isolated from the rest of the world. What will it take to engage them? Probably some very tough decisions. There may be more bloodshed, we don't know. This is a very trying time in Iran. The only silver lining is that the fact that oil prices have plunged is forcing countries like Iran, and to a lesser extent Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, to engage in reforms that they wouldn't otherwise consider. Because the essential key to improving the political situation in Iran is to improve the economy, but to improve the economy, you first have to change the laws. And to change the laws, you have to have a really major incentive to do that, and 1 million young people on the street with no jobs may be a very good incentive. So, I conclude by saying that if you look at the overview that I've given you today, I wish it were more upbeat, but there have been some positive developments. The fact that the succession in Jordan was peaceful, the fact that, a government changed hands was very peaceful is good news. The fact is that the United States and Iran are talking to each other more than they have before at a private level. The fact is that Saddam Hussein, while he's still there, is really still in his box. He's not broken out of his box yet. The fact is that the Israelis and the Palestinians do, I think, in their heart of hearts, realize they've reached a point of no return and they are going to have to do a deal. And I think most of the countries in the Middle East now realize that you cannot forever live in the past with archaic political structures, with laws that discriminate against women. And let me give you a very good example of that. It will fascinate you. Saudi Arabia forbids women to drive cars. There are a lot of cars in Saudi Arabia because most Saudis are quite wealthy. All the families have cars. So what happens? They have imported over the years 500,000 chauffeurs, male chauffeurs, from India and Korea and Pakistan. They are facing a huge budget problem. And someone has suddenly worked out the brilliant idea that, my God, if we allowed women to drive cars, we could send all these guys back, save a lot of money. So, things are changing, and the debate has always been whether the changes that are inevitable are going to come peacefully or whether they're going to be accompanied by disruption and violence. That's what I can't give you an answer to, but maybe some other time I will be able to. Thank you. Questions? Yes, over there.
We haven't heard much from Syria recently. Where do they stand in all of this?
The question was a very, very good question, I might add. We haven't heard very much about Syria recently. Where do they stand in all this? Well, it was interesting. No one expected Syria's aging, ailing leader, Hafez al-Assad, to turn up at the funeral. But he did, with a Homburg hat. And he kissed the new king on the cheeks twice. And everyone that's seen Godfather movies said that's trouble. Look, the Assad faces a lot of problems because his eldest son, Basil, was killed in an automobile accident about 4 or 5 years ago. The second son, who's an ophthalmologist, eye doctor, had no interest in politics. He's now being groomed to succeed him. And what people are speculating is that Hafez al-Assad decided to be very cordial to the new young king in the hope that when he goes, people will be cordial to the new young leader of Syria, his son. But of course, it's a much more complicated situation in Syria because Assad comes from a minority tribe, the Alawites, living in a country where the majority of people are Sunni Muslims. And Syria also controls Lebanon. And the expectation, the hope, is that if the Israelis and the Palestinians reach a deal that results in a Palestinian state, and if the Israelis are prepared to negotiate with Syria and to offer most of the Golan Heights back to Syria, it'll be very difficult for Hafez al-Assad in his waning years to turn down that offer. I think a lot of people believe he was foolish to turn down the offer that Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister two ago, before he was assassinated, made, but he did. So I think you can be pretty certain that we'll see some initiative on the Israeli-Syrian front if and when the Palestinian agreement is finalized. But until then, Assad will want to be the spoiler. He wants to be in the position to say there can be no comprehensive peace unless Syria is a part of it, and he'll keep his cards very close to his chest. So we should watch very carefully when he wears a hat and when he kisses people. Yes?
When you spoke about a very serious issue in the Middle East, the oil, the falling oil prices, I was sitting here wondering, is he going to say the problem is water, availability of water, and how much of it is controlled ultimately by Turkey, and how that affects stability in that region?
Yes, the question was, I talked about oil, but I didn't talk about fresh water, which is another precious commodity, particularly about the fact that Turkey controls a lot of the water supplies for Syria and Iraq. Now, water is a huge, huge problem in the Middle East, and not just between the three countries I've mentioned. It's a problem in Egypt. Imagine, anyone that's been to Egypt knows that Egypt is totally, completely dependent upon the River Nile. And the Nile does not rise in Egypt. It rises way south in Africa and flows to Ethiopia and Sudan. The Egyptians have said the one issue these days we would consider going to war over, it's nothing to do with the Palestinians, nothing to do with the Israelis, it's over water. So if there's any interference in the Nile, the Upper Nile, by Ethiopia or Sudan, that is a crisis. There is a crisis in the Israeli-Palestinian arena because there's not enough fresh water for both sides unless they cooperate and conserve. And as a result, there are dramatic changes underway in whether or not agriculture is really a viable product anymore in large parts of the Middle East, because agriculture, no matter how efficiently it is laid out, is very water intensive. In fact, Israel is moving away from agriculture to high tech, in part because they don't have enough water. Jordan and Israel had a water problem that was one of the key components of the peace treaty, which they solved. Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula are trying to solve their water problem by building more and more nuclear desalination plants. These are expensive and these are vulnerable. But they don't want to be dependent upon outside powers for water supplies. At one point, the Turkish president, Turkat Özal, back in the early 90s, proposed a peace pipeline that would bring water from Turkey, because Turkey has a huge surplus of water, would pipe water down into the Arabian Peninsula, give the Arabs water in exchange for oil. It looked wonderful on paper, but then someone worked out, yeah, but you can cut it off anytime you want. And that, of course, is what the Syrians and the Iraqis fear. So you're very right to raise this issue. It's highly complicated. A lot can be done, incidentally, by more economic use of water. I mean, water in most countries is a free commodity, or relatively free, particularly in societies that have an agricultural tradition. It's very rare to pay cost price for water anywhere. If you start raising the price of water, then you will start to use it more efficiently and move to alternative forms of livelihood. But that's going to take a long time. Yes, sir?
Going back to oil, won't these changes in Iran and Iraq and the whole Middle East be accelerated by the oil coming from the Caspian Sea and Azerbaijan more and more in the not too distant future?
The question's a very good one again. It said, won't the issue of oil coming from the Gulf be mitigated by more oil coming from the new region to the north, the Caspian Basin, where countries like Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan have considerable oil reserves? Well, yes and no. I mean, there's a big debate right now about how much oil there really is in the Caspian Basin. I mean, there's a big distinction in the oil industry between proven reserves and potential reserves. Now, it may be that this region is extremely rich. It may have up to 200 billion barrels of oil, but they haven't found that yet. So when you talk to oil companies about what they believe is there right now, it's a much, much, much lower figure. Also, there's a problem that with low oil prices, of course, the high costs of transportation and getting the oil out from the Caspian, because these are landlocked countries, cut into your marginal profit. So there's a lot of potential oil and gas there. There's no route yet to get the oil and gas out, and as long as prices are low, things are going to slow down. But if the oil market picks up in the next few years, and let's face it, the reason the oil market is depressed today and we're enjoying this luxury of cheap gasoline is primarily because of what happened in Asia. The meltdown of the Asian economies has had a profound effect on demand. Now, sooner or later, assuming the Japanese put through all these financial and economic reforms they're proposing, sooner or later the Asian economies will probably bounce back. When they do, they're going to need more and more oil because they're just beginning. Countries like China and India are just beginning to fall in love with the automobile, and they're no different from us. They want cars, and cars still burn gas, no matter what you may read elsewhere. So as the demand picks up, so the price will go up, and as the price goes up, it will be more and more attractive to bring oil out of the Caspian. I mean, the analogy would be that in the 1970s, you remember the OPEC countries, led by the Saudi Arabia and Iran, tried to squeeze us by jacking up oil prices, quadrupling them. And we all had those gas lines, remember? And this is the one thing we worried about. We all started driving these ridiculous little cars. Well, surprise! High oil prices forced us all to become much more efficient, and we started insulating our houses, and we started looking for oil in places that in the old days were considered uneconomic. And the great story here is the North Sea. The North Sea is now one of the most productive oil regions of the world, even though the costs of bringing it up are much higher than the costs of bringing up Saudi Arabian oil. As long as prices are high, areas like the North Sea become very important, or Alaska, and the Caspian would be in that same category. So yes, over the long run, it's going to be a very important area, but it will never replace the Persian Gulf, in my judgment, because there just isn't the same amount of oil there that there is in the Gulf. Yes, sir? Oh, and then the lady. You and then the lady. Oh, you're going to go first? Okay.
We visited the United Arab Emirates in May, and they're educating their little girls for the first time separately, equally. And the 20-something young women are wearing blue jeans and designer clothes under their black robes. And I'm just wondering if you anticipate a gender revolution in the next century.
The question relates to some observations made in the United Arab Emirates about women dressing in Western clothes under their traditional garbs, and the question really was, is there going to be a gender revolution in the next century? Absolutely yes. And the most exciting country to watch is Iran. The Iranian women have become one of the most powerful political forces in the country, who, along with the young people, were very much behind the election of Mr. Khatami. And here's a great irony. When these conservative male mullahs came to power, they put all these draconian restrictions on women. Not only the dress, but where they could teach, where they could go, where they could, where they couldn't. There was swimming pools where there were men there. They made them line up to be indoctrinated in all sorts of religious activities, to be good Muslim women. They brought them together in order to indoctrinate them, and what happened? They brought together a lot of intelligent women who talked politics. And so what happened was that the women of Iran became politicized over the years, and they were a very powerful force in the last election. It's fascinating. You have these odious little patrols of Basij, they're called. These are sort of essentially morality police that zoom around Tehran with the authority to arrest or whip or cane any woman that's not dressed properly. And it's a very nasty thing to watch. But it's interesting, the form of protest now is it's defiance in a very subtle way. As you go up main roads in Tehran, from the very poor areas at the bottom, it's a huge, huge city, 10 million people, up to the northern suburbs, which are more affluent, you begin to see, these chadors that are Chanel chadors, with the headband sort of up here with hair showing, lipstick. And by the time you get to North Tehran, it's very glamorous. And this is one way that they are beginning to make themselves felt. And of course the other way is they vote. Now I would say Iran is by far the most emancipated of the Muslim countries, with the exception of Lebanon, which is also a Christian country, of course. But this is bound to spread. And I mentioned the Saudi debate about cars. Iraq, funnily enough, although awful with Saddam Hussein, actually was one of the more progressive countries with regards to women before they got involved in these terrible wars. So if Iraq ever comes out from under this monster, then I think women, again, will play a very critical role there. So I'm rather confident that things are moving, particularly, of course, within the educated areas. Last question there.
Now that there are no inspectors in Iraq looking for weapons, what is the likelihood that Saddam Hussein will actually develop those weapons of mass destruction?
Well, the question was, now that there are no more inspectors in Iraq, because they were thrown out by the Iraqis after the bombings in December, what is the chances that he can now rebuild essentially his arsenal? It's a very serious problem. The one great thing about having people on the ground is that they're on the ground. And you can do a certain amount of surveillance by satellite, and you can do a certain amount of damage by bombing, but you really cannot get to a lot of the activities that are going on in underground facilities. You need people on the ground. And I would say that the chances are that as we speak today, there are groups in Iran who are beginning to reconstitute the basic components of their infrastructure, which was destroyed by first the air forces and then the inspectors during the last 7 years. And ultimately, if there are no more inspections in Iraq, we really won't know what's going on. And therefore, we will have to adapt a new strategy, which will be not, certification that Iraq is clean of weapons of mass destruction, because we won't be able to do that. What we will have to then adopt is a strategy that says, if you use any of these weapons, we know now that you've got them, if you use any, it's all over. We will do terrible things to you. It'll be in other words, a strategy of deterrence. And I think for a lot of people that's a more dangerous situation than the one we were engaged in, which was to systematically, physically destroy this infrastructure and then keep monitors in place that could assure Saddam didn't rebuild his arsenal. It may be that we will ultimately be able to send back some inspectors, but it certainly won't be under the leadership of Richard Butler, who has announced that he will not renew his contract this June. Okay, thank you very much.